In your history, and I just want to talk about them. First of all, you were talking about agriculture and stuff like that. That's pretty old, actually. It came prior to Rome, it came prior to Greece, it came prior to... it came about after Egypt, irrigation, stuff like that, but mainly in Greece and prior to Greece, a little bit prior to Greece. And, you know, you talked about Hollywood, and that's, like, not even, that's besides the point, because that's fictitious and fictional and stuff like that. And Xerxes, anyways, was presented to be a tall black man, which, how does that discredit Palestine? Not Palestine, Persia. How does that discredit Persia? Again, I mean, tall black man who basically runs a country, how does that discredit them? That doesn't make any sense what you were saying. In fact, they identified him as a deity, which in fact promotes Persia in a way, and I don't say that you should deify anyone, but I'm just saying that they glorified Persia. In that video, in the movie of the Spartans versus the Persians, they glorified Spartans too. I mean, that's just what you do, right? And we talked about Persia for a bit, and that was great. The description of Persia was fantastic. Except Rome did the exact same thing, and they had less taxes. And Rome also had the aqueducts. So if you want to talk about plumbing, you also have to go back to Rome. You can't skip the aqueducts. So when you go into Arabics who had plumbing, which is great, they got part of that from Rome. So if we want to talk about it as a whole, we can't just disacknowledge the good that came out of both societies. You have a bias towards the Arabics, and what I'm saying is that if you get into the story, yes, I agree that there was ancient Egypt, you know, had one of the best mathematics, right? Because they built the pyramids, and that took tons of math to do. If you think about it, because the pyramids are at certain angles, and they're at basically 283,000 degrees, and so the thing is that it ended up about 283,000 cubics. There we go. And length for the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was about what, 283. That's about the speed of light, 283,000 miles per, not miles, kilometers per second. Which is, I'm not saying that there's a secret to that, but I'm just saying there's a lot of math there, and then that evolves into the Middle East. Great. Middle East brought about Rome. Rome, you know, basically took over the southern half and the top half. So, I mean, I'm not ignoring Persia, the greatness that came out of it, but Rome came out of that too. And then, what do we have? Greece. And Greece brought about Aristotle. And look, I get it, you wanted to touch on Persia for a really long time. You hardly touched on Aristotle, one of the smartest men in the world, 400 advances in science. Basically invented the scientific method. You want to ignore the scientific method of Aristotle, go right to the Arabs and say the Arabs did it when they got their information from Aristotle? Really? Alright. And let's continue. You wanted to demonize Europe while saying that nothing bad ever happened in the Arabic nation. Let's forget about the 112 million people that died in Africa, maybe, or the 80 million people that died in India. And the 12-year-olds who got their dicks cut off. And the ones that survived were slaves. And the tax that, you want to talk about tolerance? Let's talk about the tax that Christians had on their heads. Only Christians, only people who weren't Muslim had that tax on their heads, which was essentially the revolt against Islam, which was the Crusades. Granted, the beginning of the Crusades was actually a good thing because it was terrible afterwards, right? Because it killed also the Protestant Christians, which was like stabbing your brother in the back. But the beginning was actually because they took over 5 times the land of Rome. And they took over the amount of Rome in 130 years. 130 years they took over the same land as Rome, and Rome took 800 years to do that. You see where I'm getting at? You're like, Europe's got sins, and Arabics have absolutely no sins when they do. And also talk about the Christians that were also killed who didn't convert until they switched over. And yes, we have this time of peace where it was about 800 years of Islam and Christians living in the same place. Guess where that was? Britain. Oh, big smack to your face. Here we go. You're like, well, the West wasn't different. But technology, Tesla, AC, Edison, I mean, that never happened, right? Because you stopped talking about the West after the 1300s, where they got their scientific knowledge from the Arabics, which I agree with. But you did not continue the conversation past the 1300s, which is really important. Here's where the innovation gets, here's where the Enlightenment gets, here's where the end, 1500s, of the Crusades and the bringing of the Renaissance, which began essentially over time capitalism, which ended 3 billion people's poverty. You don't want to talk about the West now. When you talk about both the sins of the Arabics and the early Europeans were about the same, or even the Arabics were a little worse. When you talk about them both, they were all reactionary countries that happened. But over time, we see the difference in the West towards the Middle East. And you're like, well, I was talking about the whole world. That became eventually in the whole world when capitalism started. And now there's hardly a difference when people take on Western culture, like Japan. So let's continue. And this is partly a rant based on the disacknowledgement of the goodness that came out of the West. And I'm tired of this. I'm tired of hearing that my ancestors have only sinned and have done nothing good for the world. I'm tired of this. Because Europe and America and Haiti, basically all of Europe and America and Haiti, ended all of slavery in the 1800s of the entire world. And no other country's done that. And granted, there was troubles along the way, but the good values came and ended that. The bad values got left behind because we accepted something new. That even if science goes against your religion, you accept the science. And that's what Protestant Christianity did. And Martin Luther fought against the Catholic Church in the 1500s. Galileo fought against the Catholic Church. I mean, these are Protestant Christians fighting against the Catholic Church. Arguably, Galileo could have been an atheist. And then you have Newton. I mean, I get it. Newton's idea was already postponed prior to Newton, but Newton invented math that calculated the gravity of it. And yeah, I guess we can talk about algebra and stuff like that, and that's great. But we adopted that. So that doesn't prove our intolerance, that proves our tolerance. It was the Catholic Church who divided the West. It was the Catholic Church who tried to put its sins onto the Europeans, although the Europeans aided in the First Crusade, only to defend their land. Understand that. And I get it, Christianity started from the Middle East. And so did Rome. And the reason why it was called Rome, because you didn't mention the reason why it was called Rome, was because the first emperor was Romulus and the last emperor was Romulus. So if we're going to talk about history, let's get in detail. Mr. Political Science, because 30% of political scientists are Marxists, and Marxists use emotions to try and get people to change negative ones. Your ancestors were sinners and they all sinned and they all did bad, and let's do a political tyranny to change the world. That's what Marx basically said, was that the only way to change the world is through political tyranny. And guess what happened? Communism happened, and guess how many people died of communism? 240 million people. So if you want to talk about the majority of people who died, we're talking about communists. We want to talk about the second majority of people who died, we're talking about Islam, who killed roughly 192 million people. The Catholic Church doesn't hold a candle to that light. 50 million people, and I don't even like the Catholic Church. And so what Europe did was they tried to bring about an equality in rights. Not outcome, in rights. An equality in opportunity. This was the Renaissance. Well, in the 1600s, the king went against the former kings. And he said, basically, you have to worship me, going against the former kings who didn't say that. The former king said you can have whatever religion you want, but we're mainly a Christian culture. Protestant Christian. And you can't ignore France. That happened in 1729 when they basically kicked down the door of the Pope and captured him. So there was a culture of Protestants going against the Catholics. We're done with Orthodox religion is basically what the West said. And then we have, in the 1600s, I know I'm going back here about a century, people leaving Europe because they tried to make another Orthodox religion in the 1600s that in part had pushed the king trying to be worshipped. And that created pretty much this footstone for America. We have society building and stuff like that, and then we have Europe, and we have America, and they're slowly getting better and better over time, but we have another new Bill of Rights and a republic, but the republic came about in a weird, gross way, and George Washington, and I support the republic. I support the republic and the idea and the beauty of it, but it came about in a weird way that it probably shouldn't have. It came about through taxation. It's like the tea is too taxed, stuff like that. And really, because one of the founding fathers, not the three, not the rest of the three, the rest of the three were good. They supported all the rights of the Bill of Rights, and they supported human rights and equal rights and stuff like that. The rest of the one of the three was actually bad. He was a slave owner, and he stole all the property of all the soldiers who were promised property to continue the war against Britain. And you can't forget about John Paul Jones and the Navy that fought against Britain. 6 ships. Understand that. 6 ships fought against the biggest Navy in the world and won. 6. This is the U.S. You know, small militia, 5,000 people beat tens of thousands of people. Or 10,000 plus people. And you can't forget about Hamilton, and you understand that George Washington, here's the bad side about George Washington. George Washington basically stole the nomination. George Washington basically reinstated taxes, and George Washington put in the fugitive slave laws, and George Washington is the one who stole all the property of the soldiers. He was really narcissistic, and he's the one who put Washington, D.C. where it is. Because prior to George Washington, slaves were released about every 6 to 7 months. After George Washington, the fugitive slave laws got reinstated, but the other 3 founding fathers was like, what the fuck, man? And that's why Thomas Jefferson became president later. It was not the next president, but the 3rd president, and he tried to reinstate taxes. He tried to reinstate, not state taxes, he tried to lower taxes, and the one thing he did do for the country is reinstated the right to bear arms and reinforced that right, because what happened was one person asked him, can I have cannons on my ship? Because there at one time during George Washington's reign, he sent 13,000 troops into a state that said, we don't want to pay this federal tax. And so what George Washington did was he tried to bring back this whole loyalist bullshit that the rest of the country didn't want. The rest of the country did not want the taxes. And so what Thomas Jefferson did was he reinstated the right to bear arms. He reinforced it because he realized that was tyrannical. That was a little tyranny going on. That was, well, a lot of tyranny going on in one president. But the only reason he was chosen was because people liked him, because they thought he was the one who ultimately won the war. But in fact, he was just really embellished. He won 2 battles out of like 8 or 9. So yeah, you really should understand the truth about George Washington, stuff like that. I recommend that. But the rest of a lot of other presidents after that actually tried to reinstate the rights of people, tried to re-strengthen the trust of people in their government, and tried to re-strengthen the votes. And occasionally there were presidents who made that fall apart. We got Woodrow Wilson, who tried to make the Federal Reserve, which is a failure, and we got Nixon, who took away the gold standard, and well, more than that. I mean, the Federal Reserve, we also took away some of the gold standard already that was instated in 1913. And then we see the collapse of inflation in the 1970s when we tried to print more money with the Federal Reserve in the 1970s. We haven't collapsed, thankfully, but those are the sins that we got. We got slavery and a couple of inequality and stuff like that, but we also ended slavery around the entire world. Islam had slaves for about 770 years. No, 700 years. And they had war with Europeans that they started for 770 years. So when we get prior to Islam, we get Rome. We get Greece, and we have Babylon, and we have Persia. Don't forget about Babylon. Please don't forget about Babylon, because prior to Babylon, we got Samaria. We got the Sumerian tablets, and we got the laws of Hammurabi. We have the education that the Arabics brought, which was the algorithms, which is great. But understand that there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. You can't just uplift one place and say that this place advanced because this place uplifted it. You have to understand the free market. Because that's essentially why 97% of all new technologies came from America and Europe. The Renaissance and then capitalism. Because when we get into the free market, we understand that people have the freedom to buy and sell what they want. And that's why electricity, the light bulb, came about. Because Edison sold the light bulb. And then we got Nikola Tesla, who had an investor who basically sold AC, alternate current. Because DC motors was going to be the thing, and then alternate current became the thing because it could go longer. For longer mileage, and less motors were needed to power electricity. Free market, anybody? And then we get into internet. We get into prior to that, the transistor, also created in the West. Transistor is the thing that is now so small that you can never possibly see it with the naked eye, but there's millions of them in your chips, in your computers, because they're gates, and they basically are the ones and zeros of your computer that basically format and help your computer get programmed and basically have the operating system running on all of that. Of course, there's way more to a computer than that, but I can get into that later. We also have the invention of the car. So it wasn't just resources that was the power of the West. It was invention. 97%, in fact. And so that's why the rest of the world, that's why parts of the world adopted invention. And this invention could only happen in a place of good values. Good enough values, at least. And note that this happened in the 1890s, that all these fantastic, beautiful inventions came about, because at that time all of slavery was ended, all of fights were ended, and people were migrating in and out of the country, and there was less tension in the 1890s at that point. I mean, of course, there were later laws made to make people more equal, and that's fine. That's beautiful. We're moving towards good when we do that. But the start of moving towards good, which was at least ending slavery, we started increasing in advancement, which was part of the good values that we have. And so, what I'm saying is, yeah, we got sins, but we repented of those. We increased in value. And this is why Japan adopted the West. We hit Japan, we nuked them, yeah. But then we helped Japan, and then they adopted the West, and now they have great engineers. Best engineers probably, arguably, on Earth now. We can give other examples. We can talk about South Korea. They adopted the Republic. Now they have one of the wealthiest places on Earth. We can talk about Iraq. And people are like, I know you won't want to talk about Iraq, but I'm going to talk about Iraq. 16 years, well, 15, maybe 15 years of war in Iraq. Really long war. Fighting terrorism, and trying to gain oil, stuff like that. I mean, could be all kinds of reasons, right? But here's the thing about Iraq. The outcome is now Iraq is one of the best Muslim countries to live in. And now Iraq is the leader in fighting terrorism, and Iraq supports the U.S. and one of the freest Muslim countries in the Middle East. We can talk about Israel. I mean, Israel had a rough start. And the beginnings, I don't say that they were necessarily moral. But look at where Israel is today. They have a democracy. Yeah, they fight and stuff like that, but the generations that live in Israel now are not the generations that lived in Israel when it started for the second coming of Israel. That is different, right? They're born, raised, and grew up in Israel now. And they're secular, and you can say that, well, Zionist, blah, 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 but the leader of Israel right now, Netanyahu, is secular. So, by all means, this beautiful country has 2 million Muslims in it, practices tolerance. Not necessarily kind to the Palestinians who part of the country, 75% of the country, granted, is now owned by Israel. But also, Palestinians are predominantly Muslim, and they can live in any other Muslim state, and all the Muslim states pretty much have the same moral values. Like, I can live in the United States or in Europe, and there's similar moral values. Or in Canada. I mean, I just love the United States. So, what I'm saying is, the idea of the West isn't creating a wall against the world, like you said. The idea of the West is spreading Western values, which is now tolerance, which is now equality, which is now freedom, and wealth, and private property rights to the world. And that was my argument. And that's the thing you missed about the argument of the West, is you said that the West, well, there's this dividing line, and I'm like, no, we understand our origins. Christianity understands that it came from the Middle East. If you think otherwise, would be really, you missed something there. Your brain is, because most Christians who read the Bible read about Israel. Most Christians who read the Bible read about the Middle East. The Palestinians are in the Bible. I mean, it's just, it's really hard. And Jerusalem, it's really hard to separate Christianity from the Middle East. It's not going to happen. You can't artificially do that by saying, well, the West created a wall between them and the Middle East. But no, we know our origins are from the Middle East. You can't artificially create that argument. Because it's embedded in our Bible, which was given to us in the 1500s after the Crusades, which produced more equality because now people have the resources of the Bible. They can read it. It's one of the books that was first published massively and now spread throughout the world, because now people who are Christian have the resource, don't have to listen to a pope or a bishop to tell them what's in the book that they want to believe in. And they could choose not to believe in it, toss it aside. That was the idea of freedom of religion. that was the reactionary of the United States versus Europe. And then Europe adopted more freedom of religion. I mean, yeah, it had its times where it had a slope where there was more free religion prior to that certain king, but that king basically tried to establish some type of new weird cult thing. So you have to understand that this is not a divide, this is a spreading of the West. This is an adoption of the West. The United States takes in more immigrants than any other country in the entire world. Legally. That's all I have to say.